our Once Upon a Pastime series as we fade the music here and get into today's Once Upon a Pastime series. We're doing the World Series, and what we thought we would do, if you haven't caught the first one of these, is we are going to do a 7-part series. And obviously, because of 7 games in the World Series, in the modern World Series, it is now 7 games. So if you missed the first one, you can always go back and check it out. The first one, we covered how the World Series came about. And in this series, this Once Upon a Pastime series, essentially what we are going to be doing here is looking at things from a different lens of the World Series. It would be really easy to just go in and talk about who won and who didn't win and yada, yada, yada. But we thought we'd take different angles in each one of these games, as we're calling them. So in game 2 of the Once Upon a Pastime World Series collection, this is going to be the best world championship stories in the history of the World Series, which began in 1903. So we're talking about well over 120 years of championships in the World Series, and there's been a lot of great stories. It was really hard to narrow them down, but we're going to go into 10 of them today, the 10 best stories, and we're going to hit a couple of others that maybe we left out. The honorable mentions, we'll do that at the end. But I thought the best one to start off with, number 10 on the list, we're going to go 10-1. They're not necessarily in that order, but it's the order that I prefer to go at it with. The number 10 team on our best stories in the history of the World Series. We're going to start with the 1924 Washington Senators. And there's a reason why we chose the Senators to lead this off. The Washington Senators went 92-62 that year. Remember, back then there was only 154 games in a season. And back then you only had the winner of each league that would move on. And the Washington Senators won their very first American League pennant. And why was that historic? Why was that a great story? Well, the Washington Senators were led by none other than what most historians, including myself, refer to as the greatest pitcher of all time. That is Walter Johnson. You look at his numbers. That year he had a 7.5 WAR. But you look at his numbers over his career, you really can't doubt what Walter Johnson did. Walter Johnson won 417 games in his career. Walter Johnson had 110 shutouts in his career. His 417 wins, second all time. He'll never be passed on that list. Only the great Cy Young, who was not a better pitcher than Walter Johnson, just pitched in a different era where you pitch more often, and so he accumulated more wins than losses. But Walter Johnson was right there at the beginning, where you were not taking 4 or 5 days rest in between starts. So yes, he had more opportunities, and something else that was different back then compared to what we have in today's game is the simple fact of the matter that when you look at the game back then, the starters typically went the entire game. Now, sometimes when you would get to championship levels and championship games, there are times that you would end up with a reliever coming in late in the game. But as far as the regular season goes, you were pretty much expected to go the distance. You did not have these huge rosters, and so a starting pitcher went the full 9 most of the time. Walter Johnson was a guy that, look, if you looked at his delivery, and everyone talked about him being the hardest thrower back then, I don't know if that's necessarily true as far as the speed that he threw. But the thing about Walter Johnson, if you look at his old video, what little video that is of Walter Johnson, it was his delivery. It was more of like a slingshot coming out of his right arm. So it was a little bit of the fact that he was throwing at the time that was considered extremely fast, lower to mid 90s. But it was also the fact that when he came at you, that arm just kind of slung out of nowhere, and it was really difficult for batters to pick up. Well, Walter Johnson had gone his entire career chasing immortality and had never gotten to the big stage. And this 1924 Senators team finally did it. They finally get their first American League pennant. Now, remember, the Senators were playing in the American League at the same time that you had teams like the New York Yankees, who were just starting to build something, the great Boston Red Sox teams, which, let's be honest, were some of the greatest of all time. And then you also had a lot of other teams in that time period that were kind of blocking his path. And it really wasn't Walter Johnson's fault that the Senators never did better than they did. It was the fact that he was always on a bad team. But he was also in the same division, or the same league, excuse me, as those great Chicago White Sox teams. Of course, what they're remembered for is throwing the World Series, but the reason why that was remembered because those teams were damn good. And then, of course, you had the Tigers with Ty Cobb, the Philadelphia Athletics, who were dominant in the very early part of the previous decade. And the Cleveland Indians had some good teams as well. So the Senators finally beat out all those teams, and they were 3 games in front of the Yankees. And they ended up 2 in front because the New York Yankees ended up playing 2 less games because they weren't needed. But they secured the championship, and the 1924 World Series begins, and you have a Senators team that is about to take on another historic team in its own right. And that was the New York Giants, the New York Baseball Giants. And of course, the New York Baseball Giants were National League royalty. And they were there from the very beginning. You had John McGraw still managing the team. And so they embark on this championship series, and it's a best of 7. And really what got America's attention for this series, it's not that it was just New York City, Washington, D.C., 2 of your bigger populated cities at the time, but it was the fact that you had one of the greatest names in the history of baseball about to square off with the famed New York Giants. And look, these games, they were absolutely hopping. 35,000 in attendance in the games that were in Griffith Stadium, which was the old stadium in Washington. And then the Polo Grounds, they were averaging 48,000. In fact, they got 49,271 in game number 5. And that alone was a big deal. I mean, you're talking about, and it's funny because we think of it now, because now as they build the newer stadiums, they're actually building them with less seats because they want people to be able to be closer, et cetera, et cetera. But back then, there were no television contracts. There were no radio contracts. They made their money from the people walking through the gates, through the turnstiles, and they were cramming everybody they could cram in. And these games, another thing that kind of jumps out you in this series is the time of these games. They did have a couple of 3-hour games, but most of the games lasted just about 2 hours. A couple of them just below, a couple of them just over, but about 2 hours. And so you're going into this, and this was the first World Series, by the way, to use the 2-3-2 home game pattern. Prior to that, they were doing, a lot of them were 1-1-1-1. Then you had some that they would deviate from that because of travel expenses. But this is the first one that they said we're going to do 2-3-2, and of course that has become the model for all 7-game championship series in all major sports in America for the first 70 years. It's not until the early 2000s that they deviate away from that in the NBA and do the 2-2-1-1-1. But this would be the first one, and the first game of the series, New York takes a 1-0 lead, 4-3. And the Senators come back in game number 2 and tie it up 1 apiece. And now they've got to go to the Polo Grounds for 3. And there were a lot of New York writers that were writing, they're never going to get back to Washington. This was a terrible idea, et cetera, et cetera. New York wins game number 3 to take a 2-1 lead. And then in game 4, the Washington Senators win a big game 7-4. And that sealed the deal to know that they're going to have to go back to Washington. The Giants would win game 5, and they would go back to Griffin Stadium, just needing one win for the championship. But the Senators would win 2-1 and 4-3. Walter Johnson, by the way, lost game number 1. And Walter Johnson lost game number 5, and there were a lot of writers back then that were actually really attacking Walter Johnson, basically saying that he can't win the big one. And it would be Walter Johnson in game number 7 that would get the win and bring home the championship. And in that game, he would throw 12 innings, allow 3 runs and 8 hits. It's also neat to point out that these games, because we think about nowadays where they're all primetime, et cetera, these games were all being played at 2:00 Eastern time. And they were doing that so people could get to the park. But remember, they didn't have the artificial lights, so they're trying to get the games in and get them in before essentially 5:00 when the sun starts to go down. So in that championship series, Walter Johnson finally answers the bell. He wins game 7. It's a big deal, and it really puts a cap on his championship, on his Hall of Fame career. That championship puts a cap on it and solidifies him as one of the greats of all time. I know there are other pitchers that people would go to as far as who do you want in a big game, and I can't argue against that. But as far as the best pitcher of all time, for my money, it's Walter Johnson. Just because of 110 shutouts is the number that jumps out at me. Now, I do believe in a big game back in those days, and this was just past his playing time. But I do believe in a big game. In those days, I probably would go with either Smokey Joe Wood or Christy Mathewson. Probably Christy Mathewson. But Walter Johnson, the collective 417 wins and 110 shutouts, to me, he's the greatest of all time. All right, the number 9 team. As we go trucking along here, Once Upon a Pastime series, I'm going to go with the 1957 Milwaukee Braves. And the reason why this becomes a big story and a big deal, first of all, the Braves beat out teams like the St. Louis Cardinals of that time period. Remember, that was just past the Gas House Gang, and it was just before the great Bob Gibson would start dominating the National League. But in that time period, the 1957 time period, you're talking about the Dodgers, which, by the way, ends up being their last season in Brooklyn. You're talking about Cincinnati, and it's to be noted, back in 1957, they were still being referred to as the Redlegs. You had a Milwaukee team that won 95 games and lost 59. But the big reason why I picked this one as one of the best stories is because this sealed the deal of one of the better cores in the history of baseball. And you look at this team and who they had on it. Hank Aaron. Obviously, that's the first name that comes to mind. Eddie Matthews. Listen to these numbers in 1957, what their WAR was. Hank Aaron had an 8.0 WAR. Eddie Matthews a 7.4. Warren Spahn, a 4.7 WAR. Johnny Logan. Wes Covington. Bill Bruton. This was a team that had a heck of a core, and this was the championship. And look, they came close a few times during this time period, but this was their championship. This is the one championship that the Milwaukee Braves were able to bring home. And not only did they do that, they did it against the New York Yankees. And it was the 5th season in Milwaukee, 87th as a franchise at the time. It was the team's only championship while based in Milwaukee. But remember, they had won the World Series in 1914. We've talked about this before, but the Braves franchise had won the world title several times before that, 12 times prior to the World Series being created. And this was by far the best team. And this team ended up, remember, the Braves became the first team not based in New York to win the World Series since the 1948 Cleveland Indians. So this was a big deal across the board in the entire landscape of baseball. From the 1940s, even we'll say late 1930s, all the way through the late 50s, so around a 20-year span, New York City was the center of baseball. And it always has been, because that's essentially where today's game that we play was essentially created. But the fact that you had these great Yankee dynasty teams, you had, remember, a couple of the championships that were won prior to the Cleveland Indians winning in 1948. Some of those championships where you didn't get New York teams winning it was because we were at wartime, so the rosters look much different. So you can essentially say from about the time of the late 1930s all the way through the late 1950s, even into the very early 1960s, the New York Yankees were a mega dynasty. They went from Joe DiMaggio to Mickey Mantle. And that torch had just been passed from Lou Gehrig, from Babe Ruth. So it was a known thing. Death, taxes, and the Yankees playing in October. And the Yankees go in and they take on the the Milwaukee Braves, excuse me. I knew I was going to do that. And Warren Spahn, who was the Cy Young Award winner, and back then they only gave one, the first left-handed pitcher to win the Cy Young Award, by the way. Spahn started 35 games, went 21-11. And Spahn would be a big reason, along with Hank Aaron and, of course, Matthews, for what happened in that World Series. And when you look at the 1957 World Series and you look at the fact that not only did they win the World Series against the Yankees, but then it was a dramatic win with the 7-game series. The Yankees were the defending champions, which obviously wouldn't surprise anybody. And after finishing just one game behind the NL champion Brooklyn Dodgers in 1956, the Milwaukee Braves would go on to win the pennant, their first pennant since moving from Boston. And Lou Burdett's 3 complete game victories, and that's one of those names that in the grand scheme of Braves lore, nobody really talks about. But Lou Burdett was the MVP of the 1957 World Series. Lou Burdett finished his career a very good player, but not looked upon as the dominant pitcher of a Warren Spahn. 203 wins, 144 losses lifetime, a 3.66 ERA. But he stepped up in a big moment there in the 57 series and got it done. And so that's the number 9 team on our list. We head to the number 8 team on our list, and that is going to be the 2016 Chicago Cubs. And the reason why we're going with the Chicago Cubs, 2016, for obvious reasons, but it has to be stated this team had not won the World Series since 1908. This team was living through what was a perceived curse. Some people pointed at the time that this was a curse because of the Billy Goat. Most others who preceded the 1940s Chicago Cubs teams say that it wasn't the Billy Goat, it was Merkel's boner, where a botched play by the New York Giants, Fred Merkel, leads to the Cubs' last World Championship. And that's really the one that I always went off of. Obviously, I wasn't alive for either one. And when you're talking about a curse, you're really just talking about voodoo, right? You're just talking about, superstitions, however you want to word it. But I always went with the fact that it was Merkel's boner because they won a championship when they should have never been in that World Series. It should have been the Giants. So the 2016 Chicago Cubs, and remember something with this Cubs team. They had a lot of pressure on them. It was known that they were the best team in baseball, or perceived as the best team in baseball. They were building up from it. They won 103 games that year. They were managed by Joe Madden, who was a media star at the time. Folks loved interviewing Madden because he gave them the quirky one-liners and whatnot. And I'll say this. I don't know if I'll say that they were expected, but another October to not come through with the World Championship would have been a major letdown. They ran away with the NL Central, beating out the Cardinals, who, remember, the Cardinals had been very good over the last several years, and it wasn't like the Cardinals stunk that year. They were 86 and 76, but they won the NL Central by 17 and a half games. And you look at the way the entire league felt mapped out in 2015, the year before, you had the Kansas City Royals. This really was a great time before we found out about the cheating scandal of the 2017 Astros. This really was a great time in baseball because at the time you were getting great story after great story. In 2014, that was the magical run by Madison Bumgarner. It was their third championship, but it was the way they won it. In 2015, you had the Kansas City Royals beating the Mets. Very emotional World Series. It was a great run by the Royals, and they were finishing off what they couldn't do the year before. And then 2016, you've got the Cubs here, and then 17 after that would end up being the Astros. Of course, the Astros were very bad at the time, right before the 17 season, but nobody knew that there was going to be all this, the trash can banging and all the stuff that ended up marring that championship. But this was a great time in Major League Baseball. You had a lot of great stories, and the 2016 Chicago Cubs was one of them. They were absolutely one of them. And you look at this team and the way that they went through the gauntlet, and they beating the Cleveland Indians, as they were known at the time, in a 7-game series, one where the Cubs were down 3 games. This was just a great story. And remember, when they're facing off with the Cleveland Indians are trying to win their first one in, what was it at the time, about 60 years. So these were two like lovable losers meeting in the World Series, and it was just a great story all around. The next one on the list, the 1927 New York Yankees. The New York Yankees, 1927. You have to put this story in there because you talk about the greatest champions of all time, the greatest stories of all time. You will never hear greatness referenced in sports, much less Major League Baseball, without someone bringing up the 27 Yankees. And why was that? The 1927 Yankees were just that damn good. They were 110 and 44. What? 714 winning percentage. 110 and 44. And remember, these were not watered down leagues. This is back when you only had, 8 teams in each division. The 1927 Yankees, it's probably the championship team that has been most referenced in the history of mankind. Yes, you had Babe Ruth. Yes, you had Lou Gehrig. Yes, you had a team that just multiple Hall of Famers up and down the lineup. You had Earl Combs, Tony Lazzeri, Waite Hoyt, Wilcie Moore, Bob Musial. I think one of the greatest names in the history of sport, Urban Shocker. It really sounds more like a pro wrestling name. Herb Pennock. This team, as we're just getting out of the dead ball era, this team had Lou Gehrig hit 47 home runs, 109 walks, which led to a 373 batting average and a 1.240 OPS. That is insane. But that's just the tip of the iceberg for this team. This team had Babe Ruth, who set the record that year for the magic number of 60 home runs. Babe Ruth had 165 RBIs in his own right. Why didn't he have more RBI than that? Because Gehrig was usually clearing the bases. They bounced back and forth between the 3 and 4 spot. Babe Ruth, 137 walks. And this is an era long before Barry Bonds ever came in with the steroids and whatnot. This is an era where you didn't intentionally walk guys very often because it was a badge of honor. He walked 137 times to have a 356 batting average, and his OPS was better than Gehrig's. If you think 1.240 is insane, which it is, his OPS is 1.258. Bob Musial had a 902 OPS. But this is why they called it Murderers Row. This is the famous Murderers Row. And it's just an unbelievable team. And it's just, you cannot tell stories of the best championship stories of all time without mentioning the 1927 Yankees. Folks will always look at that team as the best that there ever was. And I don't know if there's ever going to be another team that's going to outperform it. I don't know if there's going to be another team that is going to take the moniker of this is the greatest team of all time. But we all know the further and further we get away. Now the dopes will discount what they did. Say, well, that was 1927. For those of us that actually understand the history of the game, we build that shadow even longer and longer. So it doesn't matter what a team does. We're always going to reference what they did, especially in the time that they did it. 1927 Yankees swept the World Series. A pretty good Pittsburgh Pirate team. They swept the World Series. The composite line score looks like this: 23 runs to 10 runs, 38 hits to 29 hits. The 1927 World Series was looked upon as an afterthought, even though the Pirates were a really good team. The Pittsburgh Pirates were not chopped liver. They won 94 games in their own right. So that's the 1927 New York Yankees. And we wrap up the first 5 with the 1967 St. Louis Cardinals. And I felt like we had to have a Cardinal team on this list. And I felt like it was really difficult to comb through the stories and there's been some great stories with the Cardinal franchise. Don't get me wrong. You could go on and on and on. But I picked the 1967 team because of the makeup of the team. You had Tim McCarver. Roger Maris was playing right field for this team. Lou Brock, Curt Flood, Orlando Cepeda. This team was littered with all-stars, Hall of Famers. And Steve Carlton, Bob Gibson. What an incredible year that this team had. It really felt like they had to be on here. And the 1967 Cardinals team won the NL pennant by 10.5 games over the San Francisco Giants. They beat the Boston Red Sox, another failed Red Sox season where they were close but no cigar. And remember, you had Gold Gloves by Bob Gibson, by Curt Flood. You had a team that was going into the World Series. Bob Gibson comes in and they were calling the 1967 Red Sox, by the way, the Impossible Dream, right? So the Impossible Dream, because had the Red Sox won that World Series, it would have been one hell of a story in its own right. But they fell short, and maybe we'll go into that down the road in some of our Once Upon a Pastimes. But they fall short, and of course don't get a world championship until 2004. But that was probably the team outside of 1975 of in that era that a Red Sox fan would tell you that's the one that got away. But you look at this game one, Bob Gibson goes in there and gets the victory in game one against Jose Santiago. They win 2-1. Bob Gibson then goes into game four and shuts them out, blanks them. 6-0. So they get to a game number 7. And a lot of folks are doubting whether or not Gibson can do it again. Bob Gibson goes in up against Loenberg, which was looked upon as like the big pitching matchup. They were both going off a short rest. And Loenberg, who was actually going off a much shorter rest, he struggled from the get-go. And it was essentially the St. Louis Cardinals bats that took over. And once you give Bob Gibson a lead like that, it doesn't matter if you pitched 6 hours before. You're not catching Bob Gibson. This is line score on just a few days rest for Bob Gibson for game number 7. Bob Gibson goes in there, gives up just 2 runs. They end up giving up 3 hits overall. They win the series. Lou Brock, by the way, stole 7 bases in this series. And the 1967 St. Louis Cardinals were the team to really go out there and come from behind, win the series, and they do it off of Bob Gibson coming off of a major injury. All right, we're going to step aside here for a second. reset. We come back 5 through 1, and we're going to hit a couple of teams that are just on the outside looking in. We will be right back. Welcome back. As we are doing our Once Upon a Pastime series, and we are going to dive into numbers 5 through 1. And when we get done with that, we will mention some of the teams that just missed on the outside looking in. And we'll recap here in a little bit. But the number 5 team on the list is the 1960 Pittsburgh Pirates. And what you need to know about this Pittsburgh Pirate team is that I think there's an impression that it wasn't a good team. It was a very good team. They won 95 games. They won the National League by 7 games over the Milwaukee Braves and 9 over the Cardinals, 13 over the Dodgers. So this was a good team. This team had Dick Groat, Don Hook, Roberto Clemente, one of the greatest of all time. I still don't think that he gets enough credit for how damn good he was. I don't know if it's because of the way he died that everybody looks at him as more of the martyr type. But Roberto Clemente was a phenomenal player. Smokey Burgess was on this team. Very good baseball team. And what made this story so great of the 1960 World Series, this is really why I wanted to point to this. Everybody remembers or is aware of that this was the first World Series to end on a home run. We didn't get it again until Joe Carter. But that's not what made this World Series so phenomenally strange. It was the fact that when Pittsburgh won a game, they barely won it. When New York won a game, they blew them out. More on the composite box score here in a second. But you had game one, Pittsburgh wins this game 6-4. Game two, the Yankees come back and club their way to a 16-3 victory at Forbes Field. And this was a loaded Yankees team. Make no mistake about that. This Yankees team, I mean, you're talking about it was the year before the M&M boys were chasing down history. This was a great Yankees team. Mickey Mantle hit 2 home runs in game number 2. Game number 3, New York wins the game 10-0. And you got to imagine what's going on. Didn't exist at the time, but can you imagine what talk radio would have been like in New York and Pittsburgh? You woke up the giant. It's over. You had an unbelievable pitching performance by Whitey Ford, and then topped off with the fact Mickey Mantle hit another home run. Bobby Richardson hit a home run. And it's looking ugly. They're in New York. They're down 2-1. And then Verlaw goes out there and pitches a masterpiece. And the Pittsburgh Pirates even up the series at 2 games apiece by winning the game 3-2. So look, for all intents and purposes, it's an even series. But everybody's saying, dude, the Yankees are so much better. They're kicking the crap out of them when they win. And then all of a sudden, Pittsburgh does the unthinkable. They take a series lead in New York. They win 5-2. Harvey Haddix goes out there, wins the game. And this is even though Roger Maris hits a home run in this game. And the Yankees are now down 3-2, and they're heading back to Pittsburgh. One game, and it's over. And Whitey Ford goes back out there and handles his business, as the kids like to say, right? Whitey Ford goes out there and spins a gem. They win the game 12-0, scoring 6 runs by the 3rd inning. And so here we go, another butt kicking by the Yankees. And from my understanding, the thought process at the time was Pittsburgh can go out there and get good pitching, but they can't score with the Yankees. And so if it turns into a high-scoring game, which they kind of expected it to be, because you had really worn-out pitching staffs heading into Game 7, though it was in Pittsburgh, people were favoring the Yankees. Folks were just assuming, hey, we're going to get some runs by the Yankees. The Yankees are going to go out there and win yet another World Series. And then what happens? Pittsburgh jumps out to a 4-0 lead at the end of 2. Yankees come scrapping back. They score 5 runs, one in the 5th, 4 in the 6th, and it's 5-4 New York. After 6, it is 7-4 New York going into the bottom of the 8th. And you got to imagine, the fans were just like, well, it's over. We just couldn't outscore them. The Pittsburgh Pirates go out and score 5 runs in the bottom of the 8th inning. And now all of a sudden, they lead the game 9-7 heading into the top of the 9th inning. And you head into this, and the Yankees find a way to score 2 runs in the top of the 9th inning to tie the game. Now we've got a tie series, a tie game, bottom of the 9th in Pittsburgh. And one of the most infamous and dramatic home runs in the history of baseball takes place. Bill Mazeroski hits the walk-off home run, and I've probably seen it a million times, where it fades into the shrubbery there at Forbes Field, and the place goes bananas. Not only have they won Game 7 of the World Series in walk-off fashion, but they've done it against what is looked upon as the impossible team to beat, the New York Yankees. And it really is the romance of baseball alive and well in that series, in that season, in that game. Back to the composite score. Listen to this. This is just insane that you could lose a series where you outscore your opponent in 7 games 55-27. They double their score. They have 91 hits to Pittsburgh's 60. Unbelievable. The average attendance in this series, by the way, 49,973. So almost 50,000 per game. 350,000 people were in attendance in that 7-game series. One of the greatest World Series of all time, one of the greatest stories of all time. That takes us. Who the hell's better than that? Well, the 2004 Boston Red Sox, just a notch above. And of course, so many people know this story, won't beat it to death. But the Boston Red Sox of 2004 trailed their arch rivals, the New York Yankees, in the ALCS 3-0. They were on the ropes game after game, inning after inning in that series, and found a way to win the ALCS. After down 3-0, they go out and win the series 4-3, and then they just smoke the St. Louis Cardinals. They're down 3-0, trailing in Game 4, with Mariano Rivera on the mound, and the Boston Red Sox win the game. They don't look back. They don't lose another game the rest of the season. They win 8 consecutive games. And remember something, the comeback against the Yankees. It was finished off in Yankee Stadium. The Yankees had home field advantage in that series. You got the bloody sock. Movie after movie done upon it. Documentaries galore. And the rest is history. In the 2004 Boston Red Sox, they have to grab the number 4 slot on our list. Number 3 slot on the list. And you can imagine this was a hard list to put together. But the number 3 slot, I think, has got to be the 1969 New York Mets. The New York Mets, the Amazons as they were known, their Miracle Mets. They were a team that nobody saw coming. The New York Mets that year, they had only been playing baseball for 8 seasons in the Mets. They were looked upon as the worst franchise in sports going into that season. And they take off. And the Mets, now remember something. That is the beginning of division play. That is the beginning of division play. The New York Mets will win the National League East by 8 games over the Cubs. But something that a lot of folks who were alive back then, didn't consume it, whatever. The Cubs were leading the division late in the season until a black cat walks in front of their dugout. And that's supposedly another part of the great Cubs chokes, collapses, whatever word you want to use. The Mets go on to win that series. And they go on to face the Atlanta Braves in the West. And the New York Mets will then face the Baltimore Orioles, who end up becoming one of the great teams of all time in that time period. But the 1969 amazing Mets, they knock them off. And it was a hell of a season. And remember something back then. There were names on this team that at the time folks did not realize were going to be great. Because this was a young team. This is a team that had Tom Seaver, Jerry Koosman. Some guy by the name of Nolan Ryan was on their pitching staff at age 22. Tug McGraw. You look at the team and you realize with that pitching staff, it really wasn't that amazing that they won because of the talent. But Seaver was 24. Koosman was 26. But Ryan was 22. Tug McGraw was 24. This was an incredible pitching staff at a really young age. They caught lightning in a bottle and they won the World Series. That team would never make it back all the way and win it again. They had a couple of runs in the 70s and fell short against the A's. But that team pulled off one of the biggest shockers. Remember, this is happening the same time that Joe Namath wins the Super Bowl for the New York Jets. So the entire area is ate up with Jets and Mets magic. So felt like we had to put the 69 Mets there, and I think they're appropriately marked where they're at. The number 2 team on the list. And I'll stick to my guns on this one. Whether people love this team or not, I don't care. Whether Braves fans understand this team or not, I don't care. The 1914 Boston Braves was one of the greatest stories in the history of baseball. And if it wasn't for the number 1 team, it is the greatest story in the history of baseball. The team finished in the National League, first in the National League, winning the pennant by 10.5 games over the New York Giants. After being in last place in July. That was unheard of at the time. It was one of the most memorable reversals in the history of all sports. They became the first team to win a pennant after being in last place on the 4th of July. They were a 5th place team the year before. This wasn't a team like, oh man, they just got to get it going. You know, this was not known as a great team. But here they came. And they took off like a bat out of hell. Not only did they chase down the great New York Giants team and won the league going away by 10.5 games, then they would take on, at the time known upon as the great Connie Mack's Philadelphia A's. At the time, this was just before the Red Sox really started dominating later part of that decade. The A's We're about to do something really, really special. The Philadelphia A's were a team that was going to go in and add another championship. They'd already won a few over the last few years. This was in the middle of a dynasty. And then here comes the 1914 Boston Braves. This 1914 Boston Braves, by the way, this is the first World Series ever played in Fenway Park. Because what happened was they had decided to start building what was known later as Braves Field. And I guess I can pull that up for you. So here is a look at Braves Field back when it was at that point it was 1928 is the model that I have right here. But not a lot was changed. So there's Braves Field. Before that, they were playing on the south end grounds. It was basically just a bunch of bleachers in front of a field. Well, this team started getting very popular, and they're like, man, we got to be able to seat more people. So the Red Sox allowed them to play the World Series in Fenway Park, which had just opened a couple years before. And the Boston Braves win the World Series in Fenway Park. This was an incredible team. Not only did they chase down the Giants, and this was McGraw's Giants. This is Christy Matthews' Giants. This was the juggernaut of the National League. Not only do they do that, they sweep the Philadelphia A's. They sweep the Philadelphia A's. A team that won 99 games that year. George Stallings was the manager of this 1914 Braves team, and famously on his deathbed, someone asked him, George, what's killing you? And he said he was dead silent, then peered up, opened his eyes for a second, and said, bases on balls. Bases on balls. George Stallings would die shortly after. But this 1914 Braves team, and we're going to do a deeper dive on it sometime, but this 1914 Braves team, they're not talked about enough, just how incredible of a story they had. Just to be able to come from last place in July to chase down the great Giants of that time period and then sweep Connie Mack's A's. Unbelievable story. That leads us to the number one team, the number one story. Not the number one team, not the best. The best team is the 27 Yankees. The number one story in the history of the World Series. I've got to go with, and this is, I'll tell you, my decision to put this team number one, a lot of it has to do with my family that grew up in the Brooklyn area, that went and saw the great Brooklyn Dodgers play. And they grew up as they were under the thumb of the New York Yankees and New York Giants, for that matter, for years. And they were always dem bums, the lovable losers. Brooklyn Dodgers become really good in the 40s and 50s. This is after terrible. I mean, they had awful teams in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 19 I mean, they were bad. The Brooklyn Dodgers in 1955 finally fulfilled the promise of many Dodger teams of winning that elusive World Series. They won 98 games that year, winning the National League by 13 and a half games over the Braves, 18 and a half over the Giants, which obviously was their arch rival. This was a team that was finally putting together. Look, they had guys like Jackie Robinson, obviously, Duke Snyder, Pee Wee Reese, Gil Hodges. But it was a 22-year-old Johnny Padres who would become the World Series hero by shutting out the Yankees in game number 7. Roy Campanella. Roy Campanella won the MVP that year, and everybody got turned off by it because they said, what the hell? And rightfully so, because if you look at the numbers between him and Duke Snider, it's not even close. Now, the one thing that I will say is Roy Campanella was a hind catcher, and I feel like from what I've read upon it, a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was almost like a career achievement award that they were giving him. Duke Snider was 28. Campanella was 33. He was the catcher, et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, back to the actual team itself, the championship itself, the World Series. That series starts off, and the Yankees win games 1 and 2. They're up 2-0. And then the Brooklyn Dodgers even up the series with an 8-3 and 8-5 win. They would finish that with a 5-3 win, and the middle 3 games were all in Ebbets Field. So at this point, the home team had won all 5 games. Game 6, New York Yankees go out and beat the Dodgers, and it's 5-1. So at this point, we're going to game 7. The home team, and even though they're both in the city of New York, still big difference in if you're playing Yankee Stadium or Ebbets Field. The home team has now won every single game. And if you were to tell most Brooklyn fans they were going to have the 22-year-old Johnny Podres, who, by the way, did not know he was pitching game 7 until that morning. Famous story is he came in and the ball was in his locker or on his shoes, which at that time that meant that you were getting the start. It's done much different than it is today. And maybe it was one of those things where a 22-year-old Johnny Podres didn't have enough time to worry about it, and he went out there and just pitched an absolute gem. Complete game shutout. He won game 3 as well, and he was selected as the MVP. Both games were complete games. Composite score for the entire series, Dodgers did win it 31-26 as far as runs. They had 3 more hits than the Yankees. They had 4 more errors. But that is the greatest story in the history of baseball, in my opinion, as far as the World Series is concerned, because the 1955 Dodgers, this was a team that broke their fans' heart year after year after year. They would get so close. They were the bridesmaids. They were never the bride. They were the bridesmaids. They were never the bride. And then all of a sudden, they go into game 7 of the World Series. And look at here. They don't just win it. They shut out the Yankees in Yankee Stadium with a 22-year-old who ends up being the MVP. And that's the list. Start from 10-1. It's the 24 Senators, the 57 Braves, the 2016 Cubs, the 1927 Yankees, the 1967 St. Louis Cardinals, the 1960 Pittsburgh Pirates, the 2004 Red Sox, and the 1969 New York Mets. The number 2 team on the list, the 1914 Miracle Braves, who were in last place in July, on July 4th, and came back. Not only did they win the National League going away by 10.5 games, but they sweep a dynasty in the Philadelphia A's of Connie Mack. That Connie Mack team of the 1914 Braves, by the way, of the 1914 Athletics, they lost to the 1914 Braves. That team was shortly sold off after that because Connie Mack was having a hard time making bills. That team is what led to the then championship teams of the Boston Red Sox. And some of those players moved on to play for the New York Yankees when they were sold off because their idiot owner wanted to finance No Nanette, a piece of crap musical. Those were the building blocks. And some of those teams from the Red Sox also ended up on, a couple of them ended up on that controversial Black Sox team. And then the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers, forget about it. Now, here are some of the honorable mentions that I'll throw out. Number one with the bullet, the 2021 Atlanta Braves. It's not just because I'm a Braves fan. It's not because it was the first series, the first season that I was doing the play-by-play here on our Braves Country Radio YouTube channel, and I'm just blown away by what that team did. But the fact that that team really came out of nowhere and won the World Series that year when nobody was giving them a chance. They were stuck in neutral all year long, and they finally got it together. It was really the month of September, late August, early September, where they started to take off, and you saw that bullpen come together, and it was just an incredible story. I'll give you that, and I'll give you the 2013 Boston Red Sox. That was the team that was just a bunch of misfits, essentially, that came together and won it all, beating a very good St. Louis Cardinals team. The 2014 Giants. I mean, that was a special bunch. And that run by Madison Bumgarner is the best I've ever seen in a pitcher. I wasn't around when some of these other guys did what they did in the postseason. I know people talk about the Sandy Koufax. I wasn't alive to see that, but I saw Madison Bumgarner. I'm glad that I did. Couple other really cool stories. I thought about putting the White Sox in it, but they were really flat because they had the misfortune of winning their championship right after the Red Sox had won theirs. So it really lost. And I'll tell you what was a good story, as much as you can imagine, not a fan of them being a Braves fan. The 2003 Florida Marlins knocking out the Yankees. That was a good young pitching staff. That was a fun team. That was a Miguel Cabrera team. And they really were a great story. I thought about the Arizona Diamondbacks in 2001, but what made it not a great story was the fact that a lot of the country was pulling for the Yankees because of what had happened a couple of months before that with the terrible attacks in New York City. So that one was a little difficult to put in there. Another great story, but just, I don't know, it didn't have the interest, was the 1993 Toronto Blue Jays with the walk-off of Joe Carter. Pirates won out on that argument, because I actually went over with a couple of very knowledgeable baseball friends of mine as I was making this list. Another team that I almost put on there was the last real championship that the Dodgers won, the 1988 LA Dodgers. Man, that was a special team. And they knocked out an Oakland A's team that everyone thought, and I was a very young kid at the time, but I was starting to fall in love with the game of baseball. And that year, that season, kind of solidified it. The year that I'll always point to that made me go, man, do I love this game, was 1985. And that Royals-Cardinals series was incredible, even though the Cardinals got screwed. We all know that. the blown call at first base in Game 6 that unraveled and the Royals went on to win the World Series. 86, I was pulling for the Red Sox when Mookie knocked the ball through Bill Buckner's leg. But those are more just nostalgia to me. I had to go through and pick teams, pick stories that I thought were timeless. One of the ones that I thought about, but I didn't want to put two Pittsburgh Pirates in one top 10 list. It seemed like overkill. The 1979 We Are Family, Chuck Tanner led Pittsburgh Pirates. That was a pretty cool one. You could have picked any of the Oakland Athletic teams, any of the big red machines. If you go back in a deeper dive on some of the things that I've read on, obviously I didn't consume it, but that I've read on as far as Major League Baseball stories, some of the better storied ones. The 1934 St. Louis Cardinals. That was the famed Gas House gang that beat the Tigers. And if I was going to grab one more that was a great story, because obviously you noticed I didn't put, one of the most infamous stories, obviously, the 1919 Reds beating the White Sox, but because of the Black Sox scandal, you can't put that there. But what I will say was a great story that I just left on the outside of the ledger because we went over it in game one of this series. The 1906 Chicago White Sox, known as the Hitless Wonders, a team that went in and upset the juggernaut Cubs. The Cubs lost the World Series in 06, won it in 07, and won it in 08. And then, of course, after that, Merkel's boner, et cetera, they don't win it again for 2016. But that White Sox team is one of the greatest of all time. Stories, well, like I said, we'd just gone over it in game one. But that team was phenomenal as far as their story, because that White Sox team, they couldn't hit a lick. But they went on an incredible winning streak to end up winning the American League over the New York Highlanders, later known as the Yankees, and the Cleveland Naps, later known as the Indians. The White Sox pitching staff that year had a league-leading 32 shutouts. But they won games with their pitching, and they got enough timely hits to win the 06 World Series. They won that series. They won game 1 2-1. Game 3, they won 3-0. By the way, lost game 4 1-0. Somehow put together 8 runs in game 5 or 6 and won the World Series. But they will always be known as the Hitless Wonders. All right, that's it. We've taken enough of your time. I hope you enjoyed this Once Upon a Pastime series. Look for game 3 that'll be coming up in the very near future. Y'all have a great one. Make sure to take yourself out to the ball game in the very near future.